terrible. It's just terrible. It's the worst thing we've ever seen. We've never seen anything like this before, and it's not good.
We were trying to tell you what was going on, but you called us conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers and tried to destroy our lives.
This is so freaking bizarre.
There was this interview between Anderson Cooper and Bill Gates, everyone's favorite billionaire, who's in peak physical condition, by the way. Anderson Cooper, actually mildly kind of asked an interesting question where he was like, well, don't you think maybe we should know about like where it maybe came from or something, like the virus, so like it never happens again? And without missing a beat, Bill Gates just says, no.
They weren't interested in pursuing the truth. They weren't interested, I believe, saving lives. The nature of tyrannical regimes is they know any one person who thinks for themselves and pushes back is a threat to the system.
A small concentration of people with this very specific philosophy and view on things and worldview control all these institutions.
What are your thoughts as you reflect back on everything that happened in 2020 through to 2022? What's up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world? I'd like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's episode, we have got on filmmaker Hawk Jensen and actor and writer Clifton Duncan. Welcome to the show. How are you both doing?
Doing okay, man.
Doing well, enjoying getting into the summer here, and looking this world unfold in front of us has been pretty nuts lately. But it's been fun because you guys are also experiencing it, so things are going great.
Yeah, I don't think the world is ever normal, and perhaps the world has never quite been normal, and that's just the story of humanity and history. But as we say that, I mean, a few years ago we were living in a totally different time. And all three of us have had a lot to say about that and have said a lot about it. The first question I want to ask you both individually is, what are your thoughts as you reflect back on everything that happened in 2020 through to 2022, even later, depending on where you are in the world? But we went through a lot of madness with the whole COVID-19 hype, the pandemic, the lockdowns, the mandates, all of it. What are your thoughts now as you reflect on it years later?
Part of the reason I got hyper involved with trying to document what was going on during the pandemic and the lockdowns through this TV series that followed the science, Lockdowns Go Viral, which you guys both participated in, was knowing that we have a cultural norm of a type of amnesia that everybody eventually forgets everything that we went through, and we didn't typically have a way to capture it, and we seem to have this capacity to repeat history because people don't learn from the wisdom of it. It seems like 2 or 3 generations it goes away. And so I really wanted to work on this amnesia aspect of it through this project. Here we are, 4 or 5 years into it, and now all of us who are sort of active dissidents of various stripes, or active documentarians, or active pundits or voice pieces, trying to talk to what was going on, trying to kind of decode the truth from it, are seeing this amnesia sort of kick in. People are just sort of, oh, I don't really want to think about it, or I don't really recall anymore. It's this part of our cultural experience that's normal, and or just been normalized to the point that people, because it's amnesic, people forget it's happening as it's happening. So I feel like all of us are sort of watching that happen, and it can be very disheartening, I would say, because you think we've done all this hard work and it seems to be slowly disappearing, which is why I try to mitigate that in my own little way with this series. But it's interesting to watch it happen on one side, and then I'll just add, then you see, like, years later, it was a movement to push back against it, and you see the sort of rifts in the movement, the falling out amongst dissidents. It's sort of the natural progression of a movement, and so then you see and you see sort of how wedges were driven between different groups, and groups that seem very tight are now not working with each other. There are groups that are like, oh wait, we were right, and they've been bolstered by that, and even to the point of a whole different group of scientists coming into power in the form of Jay Bhattacharya and whatnot, which we'll get into. But it's just sort of like that aspect of the amnesic aspect, and sort of like the watching the movement evolve within that amnesia has been really interesting to do, primarily because so many people, such as you two gentlemen as well, can see it happening actively. So that's what I would sort of say is where I'm at, where my vision is right now, watching that unfold.
I was I was on a walk this morning, and I was struck with this sort of epiphany, a mini epiphany about, I spent so much of my life, especially as an actor, you desperately want to fit in. It's an industry that's very much built in needing to be liked and accepted by the people around you. And, Zuby, as you asked your question, and Hawk, as you were speaking, I thought to myself, the revelation I had this morning, which was, I didn't realize how valuable it is to not fit in with people until 2020. It was a time where actively going against the grain and going against the quote-unquote consensus, which was completely manufactured, was actually far more valuable and I think far more beneficial to my personal health and individual health, even though it wrecked my mental health for a really long time. It was a time where I became, and Zuby, you had a great thread, a classic thread about this on Twitter. You just learned a lot about humanity. You learned a lot about social coercion and social disintegration. You learned a lot about people's collective psychology. You learned a lot about just how willing people are to abandon their stated principles. I mean, it was funny to watch the people who've been shrieking about fascism for the past decade become the most ardent fascists, for one. And I think at the bottom of it for me, and me as the sort of sensitive artist type, I was so disturbed by just how willing people were to completely throw away everything that makes life worth meaning for an indefinite period of time, and to let, out of one side of our faces, we say that these politicians are complete imbeciles and no one should follow them. But then they spent years allowing politicians and these bureaucrats to dictate every aspect of our lives. And if you spoke out against that, if you opposed that, then you were the one who was being called insane by people who still to this day are putting masks on their children. So it was a very, very bizarre time. And Hawk, you were alluding to people who are trying to kind of forget about it. I mean, I meet people who, they don't want to relitigate the past, or my favorite is, well, we didn't know what we know now, and hindsight is 2020. And we had the hindsight in 2020, and we were trying to tell you what was going on. But you called us conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers and tried to destroy our lives. And now you want to just kind of walk away from it. And that's really unfortunate. And again, another lesson, a hard lesson about humanity, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure. So many lessons learned and many reinforced. I think it's really important to keep talking about it. I can totally understand, believe me, I can totally understand, even from the perspective of a dissident, which I guess I could call myself. Even I sort of have that thing of just like, let's move on and not talk about it, partly because it's just frustrating and it sort of makes me mad when I reflect back on a lot of the stuff that happens. It makes me I'm a pretty chilled guy, and it makes me very, very annoyed. But we can't allow it to be memory hold. That's the thing. So I don't think it's worth holding on to anger and resentment, because that just poisons yourself, right? It poisons the vessel. You've got to get on with your life. But at the same time, there hasn't been any acknowledgement or accountability. Even all these years later, it sort of seems like that's potentially just not going to come. And I don't know, the thing that worries me is I know for sure some people have learned the right lesson from it, but I think some people have learned the opposite. I think there are people who lived through that entire thing, and if you were to ask them about it, their whole thing is we just didn't go hard enough, right? We should have given the government even more power. We should have locked down harder and earlier, and we should have forced those anti-vaxxers to do this. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, that is the lesson that you picked up from those last couple of years. So that's the part that's really scary, maybe even more so now, as a father and as someone who's, going to have descendants, and you just kind of think, gosh, what's going to come down in the pipeline? It could be a decade from now. It could be 20 years, 30 years from now, but something else is going to come down the pipeline. And how are people going to react? Will anything have been learned collectively?
That's what I love about people like Pete Parada, the drummer who was ousted from his former band, whom we won't mention. And I know people who were, they'd say to me privately, oh, I agree with everything and I hate everything that's going on, but I have a daughter to raise and everything. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, I understand. But then what kind of example are you setting for your daughter, A? And then what kind of world are you creating? What kind of society and culture are you creating for that daughter or that son to live in, or that them to live in once you pass on? And so it was not just about reacting in the moment. I think a big part of my opposition and my dissent, if I can call it that, was the setting of precedents and what it means for the future. And I agree that people. There are still people that are like, that it's the meme, govern me harder, daddy. Like, they think that it was the right thing to do, and they would do it all over again if they could. And that's the most terrifying thing to me.
I'm sort of the eternal optimist dissident, where the aspect of, I feel that there was a process. I can open with, I still kind of live in 2020 and 2021, and I'm still I look at materials. I've downloaded vast archives of all the media from the time. I'm still working on some finer points on some of the later episodes. Episode 1 and 2 of Fall of the Science has been released. 3 is right now. I'm just trying to finish that one. It's the whole story of the Great Barrington Declaration. More importantly, about the herd immunity sort of propagandistic line that occurred from basically the get-go of the lockdowns, and going through it all. And it's just maddeningly difficult to understand, because it's high-level science, different cabals of different scientific groups, different propagandistic ways of thinking and speaking and presenting at a public health policy level, and they're all kind of coming together at this key moment of history in which everyone's terrified for their own well-being, and everything's just fear. Do what you're told, do what you're told, do what you're told. It's just this unique piece of history, and it was worldwide. It's never, ever happened like that before. And there was when I kind of was pulling together various this is how I met you guys in the early days, where like those of us who stood up early or kind of questioned early kind of found each other and were talking about it. The big concern was the normalization of lockdowns. The series specifically, like instead of looking at, well, was it a lab leak? That's a whole issue, but we want to understand the science of lockdowns. And there's so much going on, but it's hard not to just sort of look at one piece of it without all the other aspects kind of coming in. And another one of these concerns coming in is like, well, if we get used to lockdowns, does that mean the next lockdown will be easier? I think Zuby, you make the point in the series very specifically, like once we've normalized this, it's much easier to do it again. All right, everybody, we're locking down. It's a prison term, technically speaking, for getting people to basically self-imprison in their own domicile. And I did a lot of work with the Soviet Union and looking at dissidence back then. And one of the recurring sort of memes, if you will, from that was that they didn't have concentration camps; they had gulags. And at a certain point, like, well, you can't see the gulags anymore. It's like, well, it's because they became invisible. The walls became invisible. So the fear, I think, what I'm getting at is what Clifton was saying, was the fear was like, will we self-imprison again? Has the norm been established? All that kind of stuff. And that's a big concern. But my eternal optimism as a dissident is so many people have seen through it as well. There's this huge new world of dissidents which is basically a free thinker who is willing to express themselves and express it out loud and say it to a lot of people. That's all a dissident is someone who's willing to think it, say it to a lot of people. And the worry is like, well, there's a lot of people who don't seem to want to be doing that, but I think there's so many more people from around the world. Every community had its own natural dissidence awaken and start questioning it. So I always kind of lean into that I'm very happy there's so many people questioning it. Now, as I said before, the movement moves forward. There's falling out amongst different dissident groups. People, initially were aligned, and now there's this very interesting watching different groups kind of, they decide that they're not quite what they are thinking, and that, there's differences of opinion, and that turns into an egoic rift usually, and who's making money off of it, and they kind of have a falling out, which is unfortunate but typical and what always happens with the dissident movement. But my main point is there's a lot of free thinking individuals, way more on alert than there were 5 years ago. And the nature of tyrannical regimes is they know any one person who thinks for themselves and pushes back is a threat to the system. And so that's where I find solace, is that so many people saw it. So many people are going to question it. And if it comes back, I just don't think the compliance, this exercise in compliance that I think the lockdowns and the COVID pandemic represented will go through as smoothly. And there'll be serious resistance, if not outright ignoring of it. That's my sort of grand look with the way I look at it in a positive way.
Something that I've reflected on a lot over the last few years, and I want to pose a question to each of you. Maybe Clifton, you can take this first, but why do you think it is that you saw through it?
You know, that's a really tough question. I think it goes back to what I mentioned at the top of the conversation. You know, I'm someone who I feel like I've spent much of my life with my feet in two dimensions, and even now, you know, I find this pattern in my life where I'm like astride two separate and competing realities, and you know, I sort of had my awakening, so to speak, in 2014. And I mean that in the sense that I realized that so much of what we call journalism is in fact not that. And we live in a society that's built on lies in many, many ways. And so, you know, the funny thing is for me that when 2020 began, I was very much in, you know, maybe it was a bit of contrarianism or something, but, you know, the first 3 months of that year, I mean, I was the one who was, you know, masking up and gloving on the subway and you know, wiping down my mail and my groceries. I mean, I got made fun of at one point. I was in Midtown Manhattan going into the subway, and this guy saw me. I was wearing a mask. You know, it was like dusk and about to be rush hour, and black folks are so funny, man. But he was just like, he said, the ones that wearing the mask, they must be the ones that got it. And, but, you know, I was the one, you know, I was going to auditions being like, hey, man, it's a virus coming. You know, I'm not going to shake your hand. And, you know, I stocked up on food and supplies, and I overpaid. I mean, even at that point in late January, early February, it was impossible to find masks. I mean, I spent 2 hours one night walking around Lower Manhattan, going into every convenience store trying to find face masks, and they were already sold out at that point. And so I was the one who was going against the grain, saying, hey, guys, like, there's certain death coming for all of us, and no one's doing anything about it. But then around April or so, or March, I think it was around March or April, I began to say, well, wait a minute, this kind of doesn't make sense. And I think one thing that maybe saved me, Zuby, going to your original question, is that I had people in my life with whom I disagreed and whom I also respected. And so one of my friends, you know, sent me an article by the noted scientist John Ioannidis, and his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was in March, he was like, you know, this thing might not be as bad as it's being projected to be. And I remember being highly annoyed, but because I respected this person that sent it to me, I kept, you know, a little door open and say, oh, okay, fine, I guess everyone's going to die, but, you know, I'll consider that you might be saying the right thing. Okay, whatever, fine. But I think maybe that little drop of doubt, that little drop of skepticism, you know, and also my natural skepticism towards the broader, I guess, media landscape, I suppose. Because if you remember, you know, about February or so, all these outlets were saying, like, it's just the flu, brah. And then a month later, they were like, everyone's going to die, stay at home. And so that switch and observing, you know, I don't watch the news, I observe the news. And so observing the news and how it did a 180 was another sort of antenna moment, a spidey senses tingling. And then over time, I realized that even though our numbers were improving, you know, the restrictions were either remaining or getting worse. I noticed how no one was really taking any cost-benefit analysis. I mean, I was already kind of thinking like an economist in a way. You know, what are the trade-offs of what we are doing? Are you willing to trade off, and for how long, all the benefits of life and everything that makes life worth living for an illness that we already know impacts a certain number of people or a certain specific type of person? And then, you know, then And then the Summer of Love came along and all the George Floyd riots. And it was just like, okay, man, like you literally had outlets like Vox printing stories that said, well, a week before, if you were protesting lockdowns, you wanted everyone to die. But then if you were protesting on behalf of Black Lives Matter, then, scientists say that the protests might be slowing the spread of the virus. And I'm like, really, guys, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me right now? So I think, probably April 2020 on, I again had this instinct to not really go along with the consensus and say, well, something else is going on here. And I think that is sort of what saved me. And I think another wrinkle to that, and Zuby, you and I had a conversation long ago that kind of, put me on this journey, was the spiritual component. Because, I'm someone who self-identifies as an atheist and a non-believer. At the same time, I'm nowhere near as much of a dick about it as I was, a decade or 15 years ago. And I thought it was really interesting watching my Christian friends, my religious friends, be far more willing to speak up and stand up and say something is spiritually wrong, something is evil about all of this, and demonic even. Whereas my supposedly sophisticated secular friends were freaking out about everything. And so, again, I don't know, I think some people are sort of built different. I mean, even back in 2009 with Barack Obama's medical, the Obamacare whole thing. I mean, the two words government mandate I remember very clearly in 2009, I said, nope, not about it, because of those two words. So I think some people they might just be built different. Some people just have an instinct. Some people, there's some level of maybe natural skepticism or an instinct that something is wrong and they allow themselves to follow it. But, I don't think I'm some kind of special person. I just think that I was very, very fortunate in, again, being someone who has been sort of a lone wolf in many ways, and someone who just, for whatever reason, was able to say something is not right about any of this, and I cannot shut up about it. And I don't know why that is. I don't really have a good, solid answer for all I just talked about it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting answer. Hawk, what are your thoughts? What was your experience?
In terms of seeing through it, I mean, it's funny. It's I used to use the term happy-go-lucky. That's how I used to sort of describe my personality, just in experiencing life through about 2012, 2015. It's like, all right, you can kind of, it was the end of history was the early 90s, and we had this sort of 30 years of relative peace in terms of, I guess, America as the dominant superpower or whatever it was. I mean, there was a reason, it just seemed as if history had sort of paused and everyone was just sort of, well, this is how life goes and we're just living life. And during that time, I was like, well, great. I wanted to experience as much as I can. So I traveled a lot, did a lot of things, worked many different aspects of a career. I was working film in LA, so I could travel with work or take breaks from work and do a lot of traveling and try and learn a lot. And in that time, I always enjoyed absurdist humor or strange literature. And I got into Kafka lots of writers from the European era where they were dealing with the sort of Soviet bloc or aspects of a leftist society that were just so confusing they couldn't figure out how to describe it to people. And I always thought it was just sort of an interesting, if you look at Kafka, it's like these very strange stories that don't really make sense. And I thought they were just kind of funny in an absurdist way. And then I got a phone call from a group out of DC looking to tell the stories, very difficult stories about dissidents in the Soviet Union or former Soviet Union states or socialist states or left of center states. I also, I had previously done a lot of work with, dissidents in fascist states. So I was just interested in dissidents. I always thought that was interesting, this ability to express and speak truth to power, I guess is the term. And I started talking to these dissidents in the Soviet Union and did this series called Witness Project, in which they kind of inundated me with all this. They're like, it's crazy. It's so hard to describe. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a gulag where the walls are invisible. What's a gulag? It's a prison where the walls are invisible, where they've used, there's a type of fear. These authoritarian regimes know how fear works. and that it's not a rational thing. We all have these sort of rational understandings. We appreciate logic. We appreciate kind of having a rational conclusion that makes sense to us. But the use of fear is a rational tool used to kind of create a rational control mechanism that is inherently difficult to describe. And so in the series, I would actually kind of focus on one aspect of what they were talking about, because I realized that I, as your everyday American, like, I didn't know what the Cold War was, really. I didn't know what the Red Threat was. I didn't know what authoritarianism was. I mean, even understanding fascism, like, I had a historical understanding of it, and I had kind of a way of relating to history and these lessons. But to actually live it and have it affecting you day to day, we were isolated from that in a way. And by working with these dissidents and learning their stories, it was what they were going through was so absurd and so difficult. And you start to see, all the great Russian writers, and I mean, people like Václav Havel and Dostoevsky and similar ones, where they're just trying to describe what it was like to live through this. And it's just almost impossible. And it's an irrational, sort of absurdist experience where people that you think suddenly will just, their convictions disappear and they do what they need to do. There was this sort of somewhere between the ego and self-preservation instincts. The authoritarians know how to take just enough fear and use it like a knife to sort of cut out that sort of individual critical thinker at any point that they need to. And I say that as a setup for, then I fast forward, and here comes this lockdown scenario for this pandemic. I mean, I was like everybody else, like, oh, okay. I mean, I always saw SARS and like H1N1. They always seemed to be sort of overwrought things that they were trying to sell us on. And then when SARS-CoV-2 came along, or, the coronavirus, everyone was calling it Rona back in the day, and before it was called COVID-19. And I saw like, oh, this is a bigger tide and it's coming. And I felt I needed to take it seriously because I was worried about, food shortages. I chose to be well, if everyone buys into this, there might be a food shortage, so I'd better prepare a little bit. I bought stuff ahead of time and whatnot, but I really felt it was going to be overwrought. But once this idea of lockdown was presented, and with the justification of it's for hospital beds because we don't want people to die, and it was like this 2-week thing, I was this is really suspicious. This seems like we're all going to go along to get along, but it just doesn't seem to be a full presentation of what the needs are. And then the way it instantly turned into mission drift, and there was never a well, how'd the 2 weeks do, or what are the parameters for understanding where the hospitals are. And fast forward, and I've now become a student of Fauci and all of the public policy people at the time. I've worked on a second film called 15 Days, with Natalia Markover, which is looking specifically at school closures all around the world, epicenter of New York, but like Randy Weingarten, the head of the teachers union, and how the teachers unions were involved. And so it was interesting because it gave me a chance to really see like the figurehead of Randy Weingarten, her ilk, and then the figurehead of Fauci and his ilk going at it. And the use of propagandistic language, God, they're so good at it. They just know how to make sure no matter what they say, it brings it back to the fear of death. The fear of, if you guys don't do what we say, well, you might die. And I'm giving a very simple sort of summary of it just to kind of get to the point. But I mean, it's really incredible how anything that went against their way of thinking, they could pay lip service to, like, well, you have to consider this, you have to consider that. They'd always have sort of a get a jail free card kind of, I said everything, I considered all the variables, but they very specifically would use these tools like the fear of death to kind of short circuit people's egos. They're like to push everyone towards the agenda that they wanted in their various lanes that were all kind of coalescing to whatever, I don't know. I mean, we could get it like whatever global control mechanism that they were trying to foist upon us through this pandemic. You can see it, and you can see this sort of maddening use of language where, when you had the actual, so bringing it back to 15 Days, where it's very much closely follows Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who look, this isn't lockdown science. The science of pandemics is lockdowns don't work. That's what the science was at the beginning of this. and other scientists like Dr. David Katz was one who pointed that out earlier. He pointed it out in March of 2020, June of 2020. And so there was an initial kind of aspect of, just to jump into it, herd immunity, kind of like, well, what's the natural course of a disease running it? Do we need to lock down? Do we need vaccines? What normally would happen? And this idea got broached, and then Jay and the Great Barrington Declaration, which was he and his colleagues trying to start a discussion going, the science doesn't seem be right about lockdowns. We should have a bigger discussion about it. And how both those instances of trying to have a discussion of what the actual science is around pandemics and around lockdowns, and how lockdowns are known not to be effective. You can watch someone like Fauci. There's other people do it, but he was the chief mouthpiece for this stuff. Every time there was anything that went away from what he wanted, he could just bring up death. And he would just and then he would do it, and then all of the sort of doctors in his camp who get funding from it would repeat it. Then you'd watch the mainstream media have it. I mean, I have hours and hours of media. If you just watch the sort of the mainstream campaign unload, and it's just death, 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 death. And that brings me all the way back to the authoritarian regimes know fear of death is so powerful that it short circuits us, and they know it's a control mechanism. And I think we can see that laid bare from these last few years, and can move against it, work against it, try not to let us fall for us again. There are those of us who see that way, and then there are those who just are so terrified that they're never going to see through it. That irrational filter is now on their face, and they can't see through it. And so now you have people whose eyes are open, and people who have bought in 100%, and this is the world we're in now. It feels, it felt like that was something of history. As I mentioned before, it felt like that was something that happened in the past, and we were now all kind of an awake people. Now we're in these, there's whole cadres of culture in the world. It's like a whole continent of culture. People believe a certain way, and I can see them like, well, I'm not part of that, and they're going that way, and they think they're right. They think I'm crazy. I think I'm at least on the path of truth, and I think they're made a bad mistake. But you just have to well, there they go, and we're just going to have to see where we collide again in the future. It's a very strange, huge sort of macro level understanding of what occurred, and then there are those of us who just sort of have our little window and are trying to navigate as best we can and help people understand it as best we can.
Well, if I could add one thing, Hawk, on top of all of that, you mentioned Václav Havel, the great playwright turned president of the Eastern Bloc, and he wrote this very, very fascinating book called The Power of the Powerless, and I highly recommend everyone to read it. And one of the key insights from that book is that he draws a distinction between a classic dictatorship and what he calls a post-totalitarian system. And what I thought was interesting about what these figureheads like Randy Weingarten and others, Tony Fauci, everyone's favorite imp, were able to create among the populace reminded me of that book, which is that, whereas in a classic dictatorship you have the centralized power that's imposing its will upon the people. What's fascinating about a totalitarian regime is that it's not only imposed upon the people, but it's also imposed by the people amongst themselves, and it lives within the people themselves. So in a way, you could say that fear of death that you're talking about, and that fear of social ostracization, that fear of non-compliance, that social pressure, that people faced, that is also what drove people to internalize this idea that I might die or I might be causing death. And so I'm going to make sure that anyone who is breaking the rules, I'm going to chastise them, I'm going to disavow them, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that they feel some kind of pain or discomfort or worse. And so in that way, it was a very, very fascinating look into what a totalitarian sort of society looks like. And he also makes the point in that book about that ideology is the main thing. Ideology forms the bridge between true reality and the reality that the regime wants you to believe in. And that was another fascinating instance of that, where you had these officials who were sort of captured by whatever, or possessed, if you will, by this ideology, and then they were able to impose their will upon the people, who then imposed that same will upon their fellow citizens. It was very interesting to watch and horrifying to experience.
I think you're both still massively understating it. It was so sinister. It was ludicrously sinister. I mean, Clifton touched on a really important point on the depth of the propaganda, because the core point of the propaganda wasn't even you're going to die. It was, if you go outside, if you violate anything, you're going to be responsible for killing other people, which is actually way more sinister, right? If it's just like, hey, you're putting yourself at risk, then people kind of do their own personal math and they're like, oh, okay, you know, am I at risk? Am I not? Like, what do I fall into? But if you tell people, hey, you're going to kill grandma, right? Remember the whole, you're going to kill grandma, you're a grandma killer. Like, I don't know where that came from. And the other way I think that it's being understated is, of course, you guys are American and you're based in the USA, but I still to this day don't think most people around the world truly recognize just how global it was. Sometimes I talk to people and they think like, oh, well, this was just in my city or my state. I'm like, no, like most, like the entire so-called developed world, with the exception of like Sweden and maybe Belarus, you can throw in there if Belarus is on that same level. Like everywhere else, like UK, like the entire Anglosphere, all of Western Europe, Central Europe, most of Eastern Europe, all of Asia, pretty much, like every continent except Africa and Antarctica, like went super crazy hard on all of this. And I had a very weird experience because I actually went to 9 different countries during this time period. And so it was like, it was uncanny. This messaging we're talking about, this propaganda, like each nation had their Fauci's and their Randy White, like whoever the figures are that you're talking about in the States or within certain states and cities, like every city, every region, every country had these, you know, their scientists and the so-called public health officials and the people on the school boards, and of course their authoritarian politicians. And I mean, it was just bonkers to witness. It was so strange. Like the amount of weird stories I have from 2020 to 2022, the things I saw, whether in the UK, USA, Romania, Mexico, United Arab Emirates, like wherever I went, I was just like, this is so freaking bizarre. Like it was just like you've just programmed, not millions of people, billions of people have just suddenly been programmed. Like I remember, 2019 and my entire life up until 2020, and it was just like nobody behaved like this. All of these behaviors we're seeing, nobody used to say this, nobody used to do this. We've had illnesses my entire life. We've had disease my entire life, and before I was born, we've had vaccines my entire life. We've had masks my entire life, and no one, despite the flu, SARS, Ebola, bird flu, swine flu, like, we've lived through different forms of epidemics or pandemics, and during none of those was even a fraction of what was done. And if your whole argument is like, oh, well, if it saves a single life, blah, 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 like if that's the argument, then I mean, every single flu season, you should be taking these actions, right? Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people every single year die of the flu. And then of course, remember the whole, like the flu disappeared. Remember COVID came and, there were 0 cases of flu in many countries. There were just so many things, which I was just like, wait, like what? Like this does not make sense. But one of the biggest red flags for me from very early on was just I think 2 things that really stood out to me. Number one was just the lack of discussion, just the lack of like what's being proposed here is like very major. Let's say we just take the piece of the lockdown. We don't even need to talk, like not even the mask mandates and the later vax mandate, just the lockdowns themselves. It's like, all right, this is a very severe, unprecedented measure. Like if you're asking an entire nation of people or nations of people to just stay home, stop work, stop school, stop everything you're doing, and just like, that requires a discussion. That requires a huge conversation. People are like for and against. And then the other thing and it's sort of layered on top of this, was just the complete tunnel vision of just COVID and COVID illness and COVID death. It's like, there are all sorts of things that harm people. There are all sorts of diseases out there. There are all sorts of ways that you could get sick or you could die. And then beyond physical health, there's the economy, like there's jobs, there's mental well-being, there's children and their schooling and and from very early they knew, okay, this is a disease where, like, you know, maybe if you're 70 plus, particularly if you have some pre-existing conditions, it could be rough for you. But we knew from around like March, April 2020, the data had already come out from multiple countries, basically saying if you're like under 60 years old and healthy, you're 99.9% chance you're going to be all right. And it just didn't matter. Like none of that mattered. There was no conversation. It was just sit down, shut up. If you don't shut up, if you don't do what you're going to do, you're a grandma killer, blah, blah, blah. And it was just like whenever there's just no conversation or no dissent is being allowed or just asking a question is getting you called names, I was like, all right, this is not normal. And then it just got weirder and weirder as they proceeded with all the mask stuff and then all the vaccine stuff and then all the incentives and the punishments and we'll give you free this, I was just like, this is so bizarre. Like none of this makes any sense.
Because I've been working on the series and trying to ease people into thinking about this stuff a bit, just in terms of the nature of storytelling, but in terms of just jumping right to it, I think you're right. I don't think the intent was. I think there was nefarious intent involved in this, the type of thing that people should go to jail for, and I mean certainly disgraced and removed from office, and some of that's already happened, and whatnot. And I say that with like letting the system go after these people in terms of what was done criminally or civilly. But I do think it was because this suppression of conversation where like it had, because there was clearly an agenda and they couldn't allow any dissent or any skepticism or any natural scientific way of let's see if this worked. Let's see if these ideas can hold up to the scientific scrutiny. The fact that itself was pushed aside just is indicative of how they weren't interested in pursuing the truth. They weren't interested in I believe saving lives. I mean, this whole like one life's too many. To me, that's just them knowing that we've gotten far away from our own mortality. People die all the time. This is part of life. I mean, with the tens of thousands of people die from influenza, hundreds of thousands yearly, and let alone all the other aspects. And there was this aspect of they just knew, just like with the amnesia, and they know that people forget. They know people will be fearful of their own lives, or the equivalent of like a social death of like being canceled or being ostracized, as we were saying before. They really absolutely wanted to maintain, like, we know that if we get everyone focused on one thing, it simplifies global movement. They want to, we want, there's some sort of a change that wanted to be affected at a global level. And this was a vehicle to do so. And anything that moved us away from that agenda was so clearly just shouted down, beat down metaphorically through non-stop media. It was a type of media war. It was this bizarre sort of non-stop assault on our attention and our information intake to not allow us to think for ourselves or not allow us to consider other people's ways of thinking. We should have been like, hey, everybody, we're in a mess. Let's see what's working. Hey, there's a group of doctors down in Texas that found that there was this good protocol that seems to be working. Let's lean into that for a little bit. Maybe that works for them. I mean, like, there was no sort of, where was the Manhattan Project of US or world doctors all getting together going, all right, well, there seems to be some things that are working here, working there. Instead, you just had this sort of, we have to listen to the science. It's one scientist in particular, and his science is so important that even the current president of the United States, that is very despised by a particular political persuasion, say like, he has to do what science says. If he doesn't do what science does, he's an idiot, and the science is pure, and our guys are pure, and anyone who disagrees is an apostate, or is the enemy, is evil, and is evil to the point that it's okay to destroy their lives, not let them put food on the table for their children. I mean, it's all the way down to like, it's not just like, it's okay to like push that person. If they were to die, they'd be happy. If their children were to die, they'd be happy. Is the implication of all that. It's very nefarious, to your point, Zuby. And I think the propagandistic way of speaking that they said, oh, I said all these things that kind of, I considered that. No, you papered it over and steamrolled the legitimate scientific pursuit of truth and the civil rights of of the United States and the goodwill and the denizens of the world. And that's terrible. It's just terrible. It's the worst thing we've ever seen. We've never seen anything like this before. It's a true world experience, and it's not good. So that's my attempt to say what I think is going on.
For me, I think one of my frustrations, I mean, you use the word nefarious or insidious or I think even sinister, is a very powerful word here. For me, one of my, maybe going back to your original question, Zuby, about what I learned, I think another thing that I learned is that people have a very, I think, and I struggle with this issue because I think I struggle internally between the idea that people did believe they were acting in the interests of humanity, and they got caught up in this fervor, versus the idea that people saw an opportunity to exploit, and they acted with malevolence. Because the implications of the latter option are very, very dark indeed. But for me, I think something that really frustrated me during that time was that people had a very skewed conception, I think, of what evil looks like. And they, we can look at a common criminal or, a murderer or a rapist or something like that and say, well, that person is evil, or they're some kind of violent sociopath. And I think people have this idea, this conception of evil as, well, it's a man with either a very narrow mustache or a very long mustache that they twirl, with great joy. And people aren't willing, or weren't willing, maybe still aren't willing, to conceive of the idea that someone, let's say an octogenarian doctor from Brooklyn, New York, who's 5'0" and wears glasses and has a very thick accent, they can't conceive of the idea that someone like that, who has credentials, who has very high levels of intelligence, who's very well spoken, who comes off as very ingratiating to the public, they don't conceive that someone like that can look right into the camera and just tell lie after lie after lie after society destroying lie. And because they have this very narrow idea of what evil is and what it looks like. I remember looking at, there was this interview between Anderson Cooper and Bill Gates, everyone's favorite billionaire, who's in peak physical condition, by the way. And he, and towards the end of the interview, Anderson Cooper, actually mildly kind of asked an interesting question where he was like, well, don't you think maybe we should know about maybe like where it maybe came from or something, like the virus, so like it never happens again? And without missing a beat, Bill Gates just says, no, and I thought to myself, wait a minute. So I had to go back and watch the entire interview, because next Bill Gates says, oh, and by the way, I saw a study that said that, it couldn't have come out of a lab. And I was like, dude, Anderson never mentioned a lab. So I went back and watched the entire interview and just to confirm that thing. And I'm like, dude, Bill, this person is like not even a good liar. And I'm like, why is it that somebody like this who in previous interviews is, he can't even say that the transmission rate in schools is lower, because that would dispel fear. He said the transmission rates are different. And I'm like, this smarmy person with his button-down shirts and his coiffed public image, with his, his cardigan, his cashmere sweaters and everything, and his glasses, is trying to dictate, is being upheld as this dictator of public policy. And yet he's defending things that were never brought up. And I'm thinking to myself, people don't understand that the most evil people aren't the ones out, who are out there telling you that they're evil. They're the people who are sophisticated enough to conceal their evil. That's the most evil thing about it. And I was like, how come no one else can see this? And that was the big thing for me, is that people have a very weird and maybe unrealistic, perhaps movie-driven, Hollywood-driven idea of what evil really looks like.
Yeah, and to go beyond that, people, and I understand this desire, everyone wants to think that they're a good person. And people like the idea that, there's just good people and evil people. There's that very famous Solzhenitsyn line, of course, the line dividing good and evil runs down the heart of every man. And that's the truth. You know, if someone reads through history and they read through all the terrible things that happened, genocides and forced famines and totalitarian regimes and so on, of course, every single person, you ask anyone in the West, you know, they all like to think they would have been the good guy, right? They would have been the person who would have fought against the Nazis. They would have hid the Jews in their house. They would have freed the slaves. They would have, you know, whatever the so-called right side of history is, of course they would have been on it. And no one wants to read history and like think, okay, like what if I were the bad guy? What if I were just like the, you know, if not the murderer, the person who stands by idly and sort of lets it happen? Because statistically, that's what most people would be. Right? Statistically, most people wouldn't necessarily be perpetrating the evil, but they'd be, you know, trying to save their own hide. And, you know, they'd have the same excuses. Oh, well, I've got kids. Oh, well, I've got a job. Oh, well, I'm just too scared and so on. And that's just the, you know, that's just the reality of it. I think part of the reason, I know with me, years before any of this, like I'd read, I haven't read the Gulag Archipelago in full, but I'd read an abridged version of it, and I'd read in full the book Ordinary Men, and I found that very fascinating. And when I look at like awful things that happened, particularly in the 20th century, I try to like do this exercise of not like assuming that I would just be the good guy, right? Not just assuming, oh, well, of course, like these were just bad like that's a lot of psychopaths, right? They couldn't all have just been psychopaths. It's like, no. Like I've been to Germany maybe 6 or 7 different times in my life, and you know it can't be the case that in less than 100 years ago, like Germany was just full of psychopaths, or Russia, former Soviet Union countries, or Cambodia, or like gosh, how many places have had totalitarian? It's like it wasn't the case that the whole population is just evil. Gosh, in our own lifetime, 1994, Rwandan genocide, right? Like, is it just that there's just all these millions of awful people? And it's no. The most core thing is, and actually I'm surprised this word hasn't come up in this podcast yet, but to me, the biggest, I don't want to say the biggest source of evil, but the biggest enabler of mass evil is actually cowardice. That's what it is. It's cowardice. It's not even, I think it's cowardice even more than its lack of critical thinking. Because you need the critical thinking to be able to kind of see through the propaganda and see what's going on. But it takes a level of courage to stand up and say, hey, something here is wrong. Very few people are willing to do that, even if they think it, even if they feel it. So I think something unique about all the people who dissented during that time period is it's not just the ability to see through it for whatever reason that may be, but to have the willingness and the courage to stick your head above the parapet when it is absolutely not popular, and you're going to get called names, you're going to catch flack, you might have problems within your family, within your friends, with your career. Clifton, I know like that was a major one for you. And it takes a serious level of courage to do something despite that, because most people won't, and most people don't, and most people didn't. We don't need to think now in hypotheticals, because we've seen it and we know what we know what happened. We know what happens. And yeah, that's a little bit of it's quite a big black pill. It's something that I'm very much an optimistic person, but I guess now when I just kind of like look at history, you just know, okay, maybe you're going to have like 10 to 15% actual evil perpetrators, maybe 10 to 15% like courageous dissident fighters, and then you're going to get that like 70, 80% in the middle who are mostly going to go wherever the wind blows, and they're going to kind of go with the consensus. If the consensus is going in that way, they'll go that way. If the consensus is going that way, they'll go that way. And it changes over time, of course, which is why we're not currently in a lockdown and why we don't currently have mask mandates. Because if it weren't for dissidents, I believe right now it would still be going on.
Well, it's very interesting, too. I jump in and say that it's so funny to me because the people that got most swept up in a lot of the fervor or hysteria, if you call it, yeah, they view themselves as highly intelligent people. And, you know, I love that you mentioned, you know, the Chinese or the Russians or the Germans, you know, are these stupid people? And if they're, you know, like, and I don't think that they are, and yet they still got swept up in all this stuff and created just mass destruction and terror and devastation. And so, are you going to tell me that you're somehow smarter than those people, and that you have some special insight and can avoid being swept up in these kinds of things? And I think people don't have that level of beyond lacking courage. They have a very sort of lacking in sort of any kind of self-reflection or introspection or even realism about themselves or the human condition. I think, myself as an actor, having studied, people, you watch and observe people. And I mean, I totally agree with the classic Solzhenitsyn quote. And I love everyone quotes like that footnote on like page 3 of the book so they can act like they read the whole thing, but they didn't. I mean, and I haven't read it, myself either, but it's, there's that quote where he's that footnote where he says, we didn't love freedom enough. And to me, that's such a huge thing to put just in a footnote. But there is that element of it as well, which is like, I think people just are sort of lazy about it and they don't want to protect it. But if you can convince people, as you were saying, that they're doing it for a good reason and for a good cause, then they'll let it all go.
Well, and I'll add to that. I mean, one thing, there's this aspect of the bureaucracy. There's like this soulless bureaucracy that it's not all as you're talking about, like all these psychopaths. It's just those who can get control of this bureaucracy. And in a way, the bureaucratic classes are sort of the codification of cowardice, maybe to your point, Zuby, about, I would say before all this happened, I'm a creative. That means I can say, yes, I want to do things. I want to create things that don't exist. As a filmmaker, I was like, oh, there's a problem. What's the problem? This film doesn't exist. Let me see what I can do about that. And I would start working on it. And inherently, like any bureaucracy, you go to any next level. Everyone wants to tell you, no, it can't happen. And like, you can't do that. Why? Because that's the policy. That's this. This is how we do things. There's the sort of cowardice type of cowardice that exists in the bureaucracy or just the codification of society. We're like, you can't do that because people haven't done it that way before. And there's this failure of imagination that go past of it. And then there are those of us who can imagine something going past of it. And I just always consider myself a bureaucracy buster as a creative. I mean, I would get involved with something. Hey, I want to film on this stage in this place. And everyone's like, well, you can't do that because of these reasons. And I was like, well, what's the source of the no? Let me get to the source of that no, talk to the person, see if I can figure out the way around the no, like to turn that no into a yes or get around the no. And that's just, to me, that's a nice summation of what a part of the creative process is just seeking the yes. And it just seems, one of the things I did learn with all this work, working about authoritarian regimes, totalitarian regimes, is that, or even monarchies, if you want to have power, you basically need to have about 2,000, I guess it's 2,000 families or 2,000 bureaucratic units to run any one government. I mean, if you look at North Korea, it's about 2,000 families. You look at the Saudis, it's about 2,000 crown princes. You look at any one group that rules entirely a population, you have about 2,000 fiefdoms of bureaucracy that require to do that. Now that always exists. I mean, you go back to like the Qing dynasty, or when the emperor fell, when the emperor was deposed, it was because the bureaucracy was tired of that emperor and they went with the new person. There's this sort of entity of this bureaucracy that I think really encapsulates the human nature of cowardice in a way. I'm just going to kind of bring those together, and I think it's all about. It's the dissident that is the one. I think that's why those who are on top and then wield power through this sort of soulless bureaucracy, they know that they're a small group and they're using fear for compliance with the bureaucracy. And it's the dissidents who can come up and like, no, I'm not, just because the bureaucracy says it has to be that way, just because the sign says I have to be 6 feet apart, be wearing this mask, have the visual indicators that I'm complying. And then there are those of us who choose not to do that. There's something about that group is always able to subvert the bureaucracy, and the subversion of the bureaucracy terrifies the power, the leaders, these nefarious leaders who can come to power, and this desire to try to keep society free and open and not have a government that serves the people as opposed to is ruling the people. So this is kind of what occurred to me as you guys were talking about it. There's this aspect of control that is well known in terms of how bureaucracies control society and how you have to wield control of the bureaucracy to maintain that. That said, where was I going with that? I wanted to say that it's just been interesting to watch this awakening to this process. I mean, the fact that we were able to discuss this in such a nuanced way. I mean, 10 years ago, we probably could have talked about it and we would have said, oh, we probably would have laughed a lot more about like, which conspiracy theory Kool-Aid have you drunk and which dialogue you're using. But now that we've all lived through it and have seen the absurdity of it and seen the irrationality of it, there really is, it's like a real attempt to describe it in such a way that is, it's not just an academic. There's the academic understanding, there's the dissertations that are going to be written, there's the policies that we hope to be enacted in various governments, but there's also the lay understanding, the street understanding, where everyday people like ourselves can speak to other everyday people and have a general understanding of what went wrong and how do we not repeat it. And I feel like that's what we're getting at here, because it was such a miscarriage of what we considered. I mean, at the beginning, Zuby, you said like there's what we thought society was or what we thought reality was, and it seems as if that might not have actually ever been the case, and we might have been in our own little delusional bubble as to what we thought the everyday society was. But I feel like we are trying to find a way back to, or not back, but the next evolution of what a free and open society is, where freedom of expression, the ability to express yourself, and the pursuit of truth and the scientific method is something that we want to get back to, or see it evolve to the next iteration of it, because science and the world of medical science at large and medical science, basically, I feel we're sacrificed for this movement to try and get the world under a new type of compliance. And there was this belief that they were pure, they're just as corrupt as everything else. Turns out everything gets corrupt. All the bureaucracies get corrupt initially. And we've now seen that. And we're like, well, how do we rebuild trust? How do we rebuild a vision for the future that makes sense? I mean, I got a little in the weeds here, but you can see it's just sort of, where are we going with this? How do we proceed? We're all exhausted. And I guess the main point was, and that bureaucracy is exhausting. I'm tired. You're tired. Clifton's tired. We're all tired of dealing with this stuff, and it's been difficult to communicate all this stuff. So it's this sort of massive point of moving forward and holding on to this wisdom and having these conversations that I think will see us through it in the end. That's where me coming back to being positive. I think we're going to get through it, and I think the wisdom will prevail.
Well, if I can say one last thing. Because this has been on my mind quite a bit. I mean, Hawk, you mentioned the term tired. I think the more popular term that's been memeified lately is fatigue. And the fatigue has been centered around certain demographics, which is sort of unfortunate. However, I think it's a piece of a broader fatigue. And that broader fatigue, which, I'm not always the most optimistic person. This is maybe a gray pill. But I think that fatigue, for me, is it's the collapse of this regime that sort of held power for, at least in America, for the past 60 years. I just began reading. I mean, if anyone who's read Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions, which I think was published in 1996, that book is almost a manual for how the pandemic played out, the pandemic years played out in terms of the competing visions and how they interact and how they understand and how they understand the world and how it functions. Then there's the Vision of the Anointed, which was published in 1984. Interesting choice of year there, and that. He opens the book talking about how, a small concentration of people with this very specific philosophy and view on things and worldview control all these institutions. And I think what's happening now is that they've had so much control. I call them the reality cartel. They've had so much control over how society and how discourse unfolds for so long. And now with the advent of the internet and social media and platforms like this one, the average person on the street can, record themselves speaking their minds, and they can go viral because people will say, that guy's saying exactly what I'm thinking. That girl's saying exactly what I'm thinking. And meanwhile, you see these people. I think there was an interview with Michael Malice I watched the other day. It was always really interesting. And now is this era where all these people that have these Ivy League degrees and they're paid millions and millions of dollars to pontificate, and they anoint themselves as experts and as people who are more sophisticated than you. You see how utterly unimpressive so many of these people are. Meanwhile, some anon on Twitter, with an anime avatar, is sitting there just destroying some Yale expert, in philosophy, with just raw common sense, or maybe superior logic, or in rhetorical flair. And so it's a very interesting era that we're living in, where, yes, I do think that, as Hawk has been saying, that there are more people than ever with their eyes open, and I think it's largely a fatigue with whatever this, I call it the bourgeoisie, but the fatigue of this regime is collapsing now. Their control over the discourse, their control over the narrative, their control over what we think is being broken because the messaging has become so decentralized now. And because everyone, on one hand, it's a sort of weird mass surveillance, right? Everyone has these sort of smartphones and there's cameras everywhere, but we can see events unfolding in real time, and then we can see how those events are reported on and how those events are utilized for certain agendas. And while on one hand there's the brain rot of all of these devices and how it's deranging our mental health, on the other hand, it has provided a layer of transparency, and it's provided ways for people to communicate with each other, and people who are very skilled and charismatic and strong communicators might be able to use these tools nefariously. But at the same time, I do think, for all my pessimism, and Aristotle writes about this, in Rhetoric, he talks about how people sort of naturally gravitate toward what is good and what is true. And, I would hope that as things continue to collapse, and I see certain things bubbling up that I'm not really happy about societally, but we'll see what happens. The levers of control are shifting, and the power of communication and who wields power over the ability to communicate is shifting. And so maybe it's true, maybe Hawk is correct, that if they tried something like this again, now we're more savvy to it. And on top of that, there are more people now who are willing to speak up and use their own microphones, as it were, to say, no, this is wrong, and I will tell you why that is. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can make my life difficult, maybe pull me off these platforms, but people will still hear me one way or another.
Absolutely. You brought up the word fatigue. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what fatigue I have. Increasingly, is just I just have political fatigue. I just think the last 10 years have been unrelenting when it comes to politics. I just think from 2015 up until about now, it's just been, it hasn't stopped, right? 2015, of course, that was in the UK, you had the whole Brexit situation. That was Trump running for, initially as a Republican nominee, and then eventually, it's just like from that time period. And then it went straight into, 2015's also when all like the trans stuff, the LGBTQ extremism kicked in, and, is a man a woman? Can women be men? Caitlyn Jenner, blah, blah. And then it just rolled into that. And then it rolled into COVID for like 2-3 years. Then Putin ended COVID, right? Putin invaded Ukraine and COVID just ended. And it was just Russia, Ukraine. Then boom, it rolls into like Israel, Palestine. And like but it just seems like for the past 10 years in particular. And I know social media is obviously a key factor in this, but it's just been unrelenting. 2015, 2016, like just those 10 years. And I just think myself and many others, I think everyone needs to just like, I don't know. If I could, I say this as someone who makes a good chunk of his living on social media, but I think if like we could have like a 1 month moratorium on social media and just like on news in general, just a 1 month, like everyone just go live your lives. No news, no social media, no Twitter, no Facebook, no TikTok, just go live your lives, and everyone come back. I think that would be a good mental health reset, probably even a physical health reset, just for like people across all these nations. I don't know, like I got dragged into a lot of the culture war stuff, particularly in 2019 onward, and then of course with all the COVID stuff. But it's kind of funny because, I mean, like yourselves, that was not, I don't think any of us got into what we do because we particularly wanted to get involved in some sort of like cultural or political battle. It's just like you've got certain principles and you see things going on and you get roped into it, right? Like I didn't plan to be some big voice like against the whole transgender mania. Like I just saw this thing and thought it was stupid and was like, you know, posted my famous deadlift tweet, and then you're all of a sudden like you're here, you're in TV studios, you're doing the podcast with this. I'm just like, whoa, like this is not what I like. But at the same time, like at the time, no one was talking about it, right? No one had the courage. No one wanted to just stand up and say, you know, the emperor has no clothes. And it's kind of strange, you know. Here we are 6 years later from 2019, and I guess about 3 years later from the pandemic and all of the response, like, gosh, 3 to 5 years, depending on when you count it from, which is pretty crazy in itself that all of this kicked off more than 5 years ago. It doesn't seem like it. But yeah, I just think I'm personally taking like a bit, I've been taking like a bit of a break from it. I'm doing what I now call tactical aloofness, which means like, you know, I'll drop my little comments here and there, and I'll, you know, chat about this here and there. But generally speaking, in my day-to-day, I'm not spending a lot of time like thinking about politics or culture wars or whatever. Of course, I live in Dubai, so like politics is non-existent over here. No one cares about any of this. Obviously, I'm a father now. I've got my son to look after. I've got my wife to look after. I've got my body to take care of. So I'm just like, you know what? I'm just getting closer to God, enjoying my life. And, you know, I still do what I can to help and motivate and inspire people and get them to think. But I just see it still like just the back and the forth and the fight. I'm just like, man, are you guys not? I see some people online. I'm like, bro, are you not tired at this point? Like, it's just been.
Dude, I have to jump in because you are in my brain. You know, for me, especially after October 7th of 2023, and again, for me, it's just insane how much time has passed. But that was a moment for me where I really began to step back, and I saw all the factionalizing and people, you know, breaking apart and bickering about everything. And I'm just thinking to myself, God, you people are so freaking miserable all the time. Jeez. And, you know, and it's I think that's part of the fatigue as well. I think people are really, really tired of all of this stuff, and they're worn out from the culture war stuff. And, you know, for me, I'm in this weird space where this is one of the reasons that I want to focus more on art and culture, and that's what I want my niche to be in this particular space, because I don't think a lot of people are really talking about it enough. And so now I was literally drawing up before we came on. You know, I want to launch this really cool initiative, which I think will be interesting. But, you know, it's finding the ways that art is useful and beneficial to us and to our society, and what value it brings to our society, and how, you know, we're never going to be united over religion or over politics, and it's driving us crazy. But, you know, art is one of those things where you can come to a museum, you could come to a concert, you can come to a stand-up show, come to a play, come to a film with a bunch of strangers, and have a very moving human experience. And it's your own experience, but, you know, whatever that experience is, it's still putting you in touch with your humanity, and it's still bringing you together in this communal sort of space with other people. And there's a uniting power in that. And it's unfortunate that so many artists see themselves as forces of social, they don't see themselves as that, but they've become forces of social disintegration and division. But I think, you know, I'm hoping that we can spawn some kind of new cultural renaissance, and that can be spiritually healing. That can sort of, you know, mend some bridges, and that can also, for just personally speaking, drive me away, because I've stepped back from that stuff too, of just like, y'all are crazy. I'm so worn out by this, and it's so depressing. And, you know, you're so reactive all the time and angry. And there's just so much more to life than whatever is on the news. And that's what people need to be focused on. And I think that's what's more important. And sure, there's the saying that, you know, if you're not interested in politics, then politics will be interested in you, and maybe keep an eye on that stuff. But, you know, I mean, one of the things I love about your account, Zuby, is that, you know, you don't weigh in directly. You know, you do, what is it? Tactical aloofness. I'm stealing that. I'm stealing that. I'm stealing that. It's just That for me is like, dude, I mean, I'm reading books on, on the Renaissance and actor managers in the Victorian era and all these other things that interest me. And I'm trying to figure out how can I utilize all of this and synthesize my talent stack, as Scott Adams would say, and put out something that is just not all this noise, because I think people are done with it and they want something else. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I'm done. And like I said, I just wanted to be an actor. That was all that I was happy doing that. But all this stuff came along and I was like, I have to say something. and then it got, then I got swept up in this stuff, nowhere near on the scale that you have. But, at a certain point, it's like, okay, yeah. And once I began to see the other side of the sort of like, this influencer sphere, especially in politics, it's just another form of show business. It's a bunch of crazy people trying to be famous. And that was deeply unappealing to me, and it's not something that I want. And I could have easily made some money. That's the thing. That's the thing about it as well. For me, I find that I can go on Twitter right now and type up some hot take that I know will go viral and win me thousands of followers. Like, it's easy now. I know how to do that now. But that's just not what I want. And I don't want those kind of eyeballs on me. And I think that's not really my purpose and what brings me meaning and fulfillment. And I'm glad that you voiced that, because I think there's a lot of people who are like, oh man, can we please just like talk about something else for heaven's sake, please. So yes, tactical aloofness. I'm stealing that, and that's going to be my mantra for going forward. That's amazing.
One thing that occurred to me while you guys were talking, just authenticity. I know, I guess that's become a buzzword in the last year or two. I mean, before that was like empathy and authenticity, but I mean, just kind of the old world definition of authenticity. There's something about what's been going on where it's been also inauthentic. And I think we have, even going back to the original question of like, how did we see through it? I think we all inherently can smell when something's inauthentic. When you have people on the TV or news or social media, and they're saying things because it's what they should, it's either propagandistic or it's something they want. They're trying to create something. We can somehow tell it's inauthentic and smell it, even though we may not be like, even if we thought about it in the moment, we wouldn't even point to that, but we can somehow inherently smell it's inauthentic. And there's something about this fatigue we're all in. I mean, we've been talking about like, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023 for me was the year of exhaustion. I dropped. Clifton knows I was working 16 hours a day for 3 years straight, trying to get this project going, talking to all these people. And I finally, we had some successes. And then at a certain point, as the creative, working not on really my authentic interest, combined with the sheer complexity of the most complex story that we've ever all experienced. And I'm trying to make a light, pithy sort of TV show version of it so people understand it while I'm trying to understand what exactly happened. It's been absolutely, very difficult. And it's not something I inherently want to be working on or talking about. And it just drains. It drains and drains and drains. In 2023, I've collapsed for like 6 months. I said to go to sleep and take a break and get away from it all. And then it was around that time Clifton started tweeting about like, an artist who isn't working on their authentic expression really is doing it wrong. And I'm like, damn it, Clifton, don't say that yet. Let me finish. And then because you're totally correct. I was working in Hollywood as basically like a comedy thriller, screenwriter, and was having a great time with that, and really enjoyed. As I said, I was happy-go-lucky. I liked making fun things in high energy spaces. That's where my art would want to go. And then we all got pulled into this, and there's something about the authenticity of it where we're all looking forward to being done with this thing, with this giant exercise in inauthenticity that has occurred, because whatever the agenda was, whatever the desired results were, the intentions were, the reactions were, all this like talking, it was one giant exercise in ungrounded, inauthentic banter or yammering, and we're tired of it. And I'm tired of decoding it and trying to turn it into something. And I'm really looking forward for you guys seeing the other episodes that are coming out soon. I'm just working on the last bottleneck in episode 3, trying to get the Jay Bhattacharya Great Barrington Declaration and this weird obsession about herd immunity that the mainstream policy scientists like Anthony Fauci felt needed to be taken out from the beginning, even though that's the natural progression of every respiratory disease is herd immunity. But that I've realized like that was like from the get-go one of the great propagandistic things that I've been decoding and telling the story of, but to the point of that's not my authentic self-expression to try and decode that for everyone and what we're doing and everything. So it's this interesting sort of, we all rose to the occasion to do what was needed as participants in this unbelievable world experience. But I really look forward to in a year or two, all of us having another podcast where we're talking about entirely different, interesting, creative exploits that we're really excited about. And I can't wait to share what I'm doing with you guys because it's we've earned it.
Amen. So to close it out, guys, where can people find and follow you online? Where do you want to send them?
Well, you can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Clifton A. Duncan. I also have a Substack. It's called The State of the Arts, but we're going to be doing some exciting rebranding soon. But you can find me there. Just search my name. You'll find me there. I'm also working on a new publication called Becoming Thomas Sowell, and that chronicles my journey in creating the Soul play. Last year, I did a successful crowdfunder for the development of a script and a eventual stage production of a play based on Thomas Sowell's life. And so I'm chronicling that process, the creative process, over on Substack at Becoming Thomas Sowell. I also have a YouTube channel, which is pretty bare bones right now. But again, like I said, I'm working on a rebrand and a relaunch. But you can find me, Clifton Duncan, over there. And those are the main avenues you can find me. So come over, say hello, come experience my tactical aloofness on Twitter while I'm talking about nothing and enjoying it. And that's, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Yeah. And so right now I'm working on Follow the Science. It's followthescienceseries.com. followthescienceseries.com, which is the Follow the Science series that I've been working on. The first episode, Lockdowns Go Viral. The first episode is actually available for free. You can go sign up and watch it there, and that'll get you into the second episode. Third episode's coming out soon, and it'll eventually be a 6-episode series that we're very excited to get out the door. I have a small Twitter account at Hawk Jensen, which I'll be developing much more fully soon as everything's out the door on Follow the Science side. And I've also been producing a project called 15 Days, the real story of America's pandemic school closures, which is at 15daysfilm.com. And that's about the story of school closures and the effects of children in the United States. So I've been very focused on all things lockdown for the last several years, and looking forward to getting these films out the door to push back against the overall amnesia that we're suffering as a culture, so we can kind of keep this wisdom and keep our self-expressive artistic selves in the forefront, living our most authentic lives and hanging out and having a laugh. So please check out those shows, and I look forward to talking to you guys again soon.
Nice one, guys. Hawk, Clifton, always a pleasure to speak to you both. Thank you for the gift of your time.
Thanks, Zuby.
Thanks for having me on, man. Good to see you again.